Jeff Kripal is a dear friend of the Institute. He's over here when we have open houses and those kind of things, and we're excited to have him here to hear in just a moment. And Jeffrey is the Newton Rayzor Professor and Chair of Religious Studies at Rice University. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 1993. And we're blessed to have him in this region, and particularly right here at Rice University, and to be a part of us at the Institute. He's written many books, or contributed to them, and worked together with others. And I want to mention just a couple of them. One of them is Road of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, and it should be a very exciting read. And then Callie's Child, which is looking at sort of the mystical story of the life of one of those very special individuals in Hinduism, a popular Hindu goddess. So he has spread from all the way from being at least in a Benedictine monastery for a time during his training, all the way to the west, to the east, I should say, all the way to India, and back again here for us right here. So we are honored to have this great man here. I love him very much, and I know you're going to look forward to hearing whatever he has to say. His talk tonight is on why everyone should be a comparativist, and we're going to learn what that means. So please give a warm welcome to Jeffrey Kripal.
Thanks, John. That was a nice, lovely introduction. So what I want to do this evening for the next 3 hours. I won't do that to you. I want to just 3 simple parts here. What really what John asked me to talk about is really a textbook that I'm writing at the moment. We have a class at Rice called Relly 101. It's not a very sexy title. It's called Relly 101. It's pretty much an introduction to the study of religion, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest, classes in the university. It draws about between 200 and 250 students every fall, and it's designed to teach young people how to think and talk about religion in nuanced, sophisticated, critical ways. Our culture does not give people those skills anywhere else in the educational system, and so we try to do that in that course. And so my talk tonight, it's really in 3 parts. There's a very brief, very formal lecture. It'll take about 10 minutes tops. I want to just give you some meat to put on the table. And then in the second part, I want to just kind of walk you through the textbook. You have the table of contents in your hand there. And then in the third part, just say a few words about why these cognitive skills are so important, and why you may be using them right now in your own professional lives and not even be aware of it. So that's why everybody should be comparative. Before I get into the lecture, though, I just want to make a simple observation. When we get students at the university, at really any university or college, in a class on the study of religion, we are essentially getting them for the first time. We're doing remedial work. When our colleagues in chemistry or history or political science get first-year college students, they can assume all sorts of things that they've gotten in high school. We can assume nothing. Religion is not, the study of religion is not taught in the high schools. Sometimes religion is described in a world history course or a geography course, but never are young people given tools to think rationally and openly about religion. So one of the ways I often begin my classes at Rice is telling them when I was their age, there were 3 things my mother and father told me to avoid in polite conversation. sex, religion, and politics. And then I said, and that's all we're going to talk about now for 4 months. And that pretty much summarizes what the study of religion is. It's talking about things that we're not supposed to talk about. And I think I'll explain why I think it's so important that we talk about them. So let me do this really formal. This is a reading, actually, from the introduction to the textbook. And then we'll get into the textbook and have a conversation. John, how long do you want this to run? I'm a professional blabber. I can go as long or as little as you like, so you just tell me.
You be free.
That's dangerous.
So you run down.
Okay, yeah. No, I won't speak very loud. I'd rather have a conversation than just talk. So this is from the introduction to the textbook. The professional study of religion is a rare bird in most people's lives. It is not often seen. Religion, for example, is almost never studied in the high schools in the U.S. Religions may well be safely described there in, say, a history course, but they are never critically compared or analyzed. As a consequence, virtually none of the undergraduates who come to Rice each fall consider majoring in the study of religion. And most of them think that our department is here to meet someone's religious needs or affirm some very particular set of beliefs. They also assume that a religious studies major is somehow soft, as opposed to the sciences, which are somehow hard. The truth is that the study of religion aligns itself with no particular religion and is in fact deeply suspicious of any and all absolute truth claims. This does not mean, however, that the field is somehow against religion. The discipline as a discipline is neither pro-religious nor anti-religious. There is, moreover, nothing easy or soft about what we do. We challenge young human beings to their very cores. We teach people to think critically about religious systems the same way that political scientists think about political institutions, sociologists think about social systems, anthropologists think about cultures, or literary critics think about literature. Indeed, we use all of these methods to do our own work, for religions are always and everywhere, also political, social, cultural, and textual. You might say that we are radically interdisciplinary. I prefer to think of us as intellectually promiscuous. I would go so far as to claim that the critical study of religion is the most relevant, the most exciting and dangerous, the most profound, and the most radical intellectual practice presently practiced in the colleges and universities of the Western world.
Would you repeat that sentence? That's a profound sentence. Say that again.
This is filled with profound sentences.
This is very profound.
Okay. I would go so far as to claim that the critical study of religion is the most relevant, the most exciting and dangerous, the most profound, and the most radical intellectual practice presently practiced in the colleges and universities of the Western world. The so-called hard sciences, in fact, do the easy stuff. They study things that can be measured, that can be controlled, that can be predicted. We do the truly hard stuff. We study things that cannot be measured, that cannot be controlled, that are fiercely alive, and that are ultimately about that hardest of all philosophical and scientific problems, the nature of consciousness itself, which you are free to call the human spirit or soul. So how do we do this? Primarily through something called comparison. So what is comparison? Most simply, comparison is the intellectual act of negotiating sameness and difference in a set of observations. More complexly, this act of negotiating sameness and difference leads to the recognition of patterns and a subsequent classification of what has been observed. Most complexly, these classifications in turn lead to a theory about those patterns and classifications that is a model of what might be behind them. Comparison lies at the root of some of the simplest acts of perception and thinking. You cannot think without comparing. nor can you recognize anything in the environment. It also lies at the root of some of the most stunning and successful achievements of human thought. Take Darwin's idea of natural selection, for example, which has since morphed into the achievements of evolutionary biology, the discovery of the DNA helix, and the mapping of the human genome. Darwin's original discovery involved no mathematical formulas or computers, none. Rather, he used the same exact methods that the comparative study of religion has employed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Extensive travel, keen observation, a sensitivity to context and locale, a profound historical sensibility, careful comparison, and systematic classification. He compared this wing in this place to that wing in that place, this limb to that limb, this beak to that bill, and so on, until he recognized patterns, classified them into larger wholes, mapped them through long stretches of time, and eventually arrived at his model of natural selection. Darwin was a comparativist through and through. But what if we are now comparing subjects instead of objects? Worlds made of meaning instead of things made of muscle and matter. If you think about human beings, about the seeming infinity of human cultures they have created, and the common human nature that they all share, you will end up comparing in an especially obvious and especially fraught way. For one thing, you are a human being. Okay? Darwin was not a monkey or a bird. So in some sense, you are comparing you. A weird paradoxical exercise from the start. We call this looking into the mirror reflexivity. It is fraught by a very specific tension or balance, which we might define most simply as a both-and. Let us refer to the two poles of this both-and with two of the terms of our opening definition. Let us refer to them as sameness and difference. We are all very, very similar. Hence the shared human nature that we all have. The same gene pool, the same basic physiology, neurology, etc. And we are all so very different. Hence the infinity of human cultures. There are religious traditions that emphasize this human sameness, this shared universal form of something we call consciousness, mind, soul, or the self. Moreover, many of our most impressive and noble modern values, like human rights, civil liberties, and racial and gender equity, flow out of notions of sameness and equality. So sometimes sameness is justice. It's essentially what justice is. It's people wanting to be treated the same. There are also religious traditions and whole bodies of critical theory, however, that emphasize the differences, the specificities, the absolutely unique aspects of being human in this or that local culture. The latter bodies of theory not only generally produce better and more generally produce better and more detailed scholarship, they are also advanced for key ethical and moral reasons. After all, we know all too well how political, social, and religious systems are very good at squashing difference, persecuting minorities, even killing whole peoples who do not fit into some universal notion of what a human being is or should be. Similarly, the history of religions is all too full of pogroms, violence, and genocide based on exactly this same principle of sameness, with the majority and the powerful always getting to decide what, or really who, that sameness is. So sometimes sameness is deadly. Okay? So the moral here is any responsible and ethical comparative practice must balance this human sameness and this human difference and see moral value in both. Okay? If you fall off either chair, you're not doing responsible good comparison. If you think all religions are the same, you're not comparing. If you think we're all Martians to each other and there's nothing to connect us, you're not comparing. You've got to have both, always. Okay? It is no doubt an exaggeration, but an instructive one, to suggest that most, here's another profound statement, John.
Thank you very much. I'll write it down.
Yeah, let's get ready. It is no doubt an exaggeration, but an instructive one, to suggest that most of our world's social, political, and religious conflicts depend on a fundamental failure to hold that both-and in balance. That is, they arise, at least partly, from our inability to look into the mirror of history and culture and compare one another in subtle and sophisticated ways, as opposed to just seeing our own faces, or the faces of demons, terrorists, unbelievers, or infidels. More specifically, many of our most dangerous global problems arise from individuals, groups, or whole political systems trying to suppress or erase one another, or one or other pole of this species-wide spectrum of sameness and difference. It's a depressingly familiar logic. We must all be the same, believe the same things, worship the same deity, think the same thoughts, eat the same things, dress the same way, perform the same rituals, hold the same moral values, have the same color of skin, feel the same sexual desires, and so on. Or conversely, we must be completely different. So different, in fact, that they are no longer anything like us. And so we can kill them, or at least pass laws and policies to make their lives sufficiently miserable. But we, of course, are not all the same, nor are we completely different, nor will we ever be either. There is a risk, then, in comparing religions. But there is also a real excitement and real promise. After all, if many of our social and political problems lie in our failure to compare one another in a sufficiently radical way, the long-lasting resolution of these problems may well lie in our learning to compare ourselves better. Okay? The problem and the promise, in other words, are both functions of comparative practices, either done well or done poorly. Okay? My final paragraph here then. But there's another reason for enthusiasm. That reason comes down to a whole complex of deep and powerful human responses to what we might call, for lack of a better expression, the realm of the sacred. Such a realm has inspired terror, intolerance, and violence, for sure, but it has also inspired beauty, justice, order, fascination, and awe. Religions are some of the most stunning, uncanny, fantastic, baffling, outrageous, sophisticated, weird, complex, and meaningful products that human beings have created in response to, well, we don't really know why. Comparing religions, that's the name of the textbook, is about those human responses, which we know quite a bit about, to the realm of the sacred, which we know almost nothing about. More specifically, it is about the human religious imagination and its cultural expressions, expressions that we can study the same way that we study any other cultural product, such as a political system, a work of art or literature, a piece of architecture, or a language. As for the realm of the sacred itself, we will never quite get to that in this textbook. We cannot get to that for one blazingly simple reason. The sacred is not a thing or an object, although it may very well be expressed through things and objects. So we are left in a situation in which we are claiming to study that which we cannot know from this side of what we can know, acknowledging both the terror and the beauty of the subject, poised between the problems and the promises of our own future, with the whole world hanging in the balance. Okay, thank you. Wow. So that's just that's from the introduction to the textbook. And then I just want to take you through the textbook and kind of show you how it's set up and how this class works and what our goals are. And then maybe we can I won't stray far, John. I forgot about that.
Good.
So the reason the subtitle is called A Textbook Initiation is because the textbook is set up exactly like an initiation. So in anthropology, anthropologists have been studying initiation rituals for hundreds of years. And in the early part of the 20th century, a man by the name of Arnold Mangenep observed that there were basically three parts to any initiation. There was the sort of pre-initiation stage in which the person was still whomever the person is. So the boy, let's take a puberty initiation ritual in which a boy is turned into a man ritually. Okay. So before the ritual, the pre-ritual state, it's just a boy. He probably lives with the women. He probably plays with the other boys. He's treated like a boy. He's a boy. Okay? He gets to somewhere around puberty or adolescence when everything goes to hell. And the tribe or the community decides, well, we need to take these boys out and we need to ritually turn them into men. And so there's different ways of doing this, taking them into the forest, isolating them, scary rituals. So there's this middle period to the initiation in which that earlier social identity is broken down, where your boyness is dissolved, and you're out in the forest with the men, or you're on a hunt, or you're wherever you are. And so that's what we call the liminal stage of the initiation, the in-between stage. You're neither a boy, but you're not yet quite a man. And then there's the post-ritual stage of the initiation, in which that person is brought back into the community, and now he's treated as a man. He can no longer live in the women's quarters. He might be given a new name. Might be given a different social function, but he's a fundamentally different person now. Okay? So there's just three stages. There's pre-ritual stage, there's this liminal kind of take down, tear down, dissolve stage, and then there's let's put the person back together into a new form. Okay? Now, what's interesting, if you think about that, is that in our contemporary American culture, we really don't have any initiation rituals, except for one. I know we have minor religious initiations like confirmation or something, but they're not. They don't do the stuff for the least mine didn't. The one really serious initiation ritual we have in American culture is in fact college. Okay, so what happens? Well, we have these kids, and they're kids. They're legally kids before they turn 18. They're in their family. They live with their family. They go to high school. There's not much actually we can do with them in terms of the study of religion without getting into a whole lot of trouble with their parents or the PTA, right? So we stay away. We stay away from the high schools. They turn 18, and they're sent to this 4-year ritual process, and it's all ritual if you think about it. Sitting in chairs, you guys, this is a ritual process. Sitting in chairs, watching some guy with a piece of silk tied around his neck talking. I mean, this is all ritual. So they do this for 4 years, and what happens is these young people are no longer with their families. They're no longer in their high schools. They're put in these colleges and dorms with people from all over the world, from all kinds of other cultures and belief systems. It's very confusing. It's very transformative for them. And then they take all these classes to try to kind of process this with the goal of what? Well, hopefully, they'll come out the other end as a new person with a college degree, capable of pursuing some kind of profession or some kind of adult life. Okay, so that's our initiation ritual. And so what the textbook does is it says, okay, let's take that, and let's run with that, and let's form the semester into these 3 parts. And so if you look at the table of contents, and I'm not going to go through all of this because it would take way too long, but part 1 is really about the preliminal stage. It's about defining who we are, where the study of religion came from, what the basic tools are, what the history of the field is. And this usually takes about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. And I ask the students to define their own religious worldview, which they usually haven't had to articulate. And I don't grade that, of course, but to ask them, what is the meaning of life? Where do you come from? Where are you going? What happens to you when you die? How do you know the proper way to live? Just basic religious questions. And they kind of struggle with those, and they kind of put those into a system. But the real question I want them to struggle with, day one, is how do you understand your religious world in relationship to everybody else's religious worlds? In other words, what is your answer to religious pluralism? To the fact that people are religious in thousands, if not millions of ways. There's no one way of being religious. How do you explain that? How does your religious world explain the radical plurality of the human species when it comes to religion? And they don't. Inevitably, they don't have an answer. They might have an intuitive answer to that. They may have went to high school in a very pluralistic suburb, and they have a kind of gut feeling about it. They may have come from a high school where everybody looked just like them, and they may not have even thought through the issues. But inevitably, they don't have the terms, they don't have the cognitive skills, they don't have the language to even talk about these things in a nuanced way. And so I simply tell them, I said, okay, we're going to move through these three stages. I'm going to tell you where the study of religion comes from. We're going to talk about your religious world. And then we're going to spend 2 months in part 2 really, really confusing you. And that is my goal in part 2, is to really mess with you. Okay? And by messing with them, I don't mean going after their beliefs. I don't mean saying bad things about their religion. I mean just showing them how complex the history of religions it really is, and how there are these patterns out there. And so we take them through. Chapter 4 is the language of myth and ritual. And by myth, we don't mean not true. We mean a story, a sacred story that grounds a community. And ritual is essentially the theater of a religious world. Ritual is a reenactment of a myth, always. Important rituals, anyway. So we get them to see how religions are built up through narrative and through storytelling and through theater and ritual and everyday human activity. And then in chapter 5, we turn to the natural world and show them how human beings have long experienced nature, not as nature, but as supernature, as a kind of filter or as a kind of a zone of the sacred appearing. Then in chapter 6, we look at food and sex in the human body and these symbolic frameworks of seed and soil, seed being male and soil being female, and how problematic that religious symbolism is today, and why it's so problematic. And why virtually every single religious issue in the news is really a sexual issue or a gender issue. Just name them. Think of them. They all have to do with gender. Every single one. Why is that? In chapter 7, we look at religious institutions, different forms of religious authority, different types of what we call charisma. In chapter 8, we look at visionary states, near-death experiences, the kind of weird, uncanny dimensions of religious traditions. In chapter 9, we look at the question of the soul and the afterlife, whether we live once or many times or not at all. And so, by the time we've gone through all this stuff, they're thinking. I mean, they come in thinking. They come in asking questions in their head. And the goal of the class is essentially to create a safe space in which they can ask their questions, either internally or out loud in the classroom. Okay? And so that starts to happen in that middle period. And then in the part 3, we promised them all along we're not going to leave them hanging. Yes, we're out to confuse you, but we're not going to leave you confused, nor are we going to give you answers. The goal is not for me to tell them the answer. I don't actually know the answers. Our goal is to help them ask better questions and to come to their own answers. And so in part 3, we go through three basic ways that you can actually answer the question of religious pluralism. And each of these ways actually works, but different people will adopt different ones. The first set of answers is what I call faithful rereadings. These are religious ways of addressing religious pluralism. The main ones are exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, which we can define, but I think that will take us too far afield here. But these are very, very simple techniques that if I defined them and talked about them, you'd recognize them instantly as ways that different religious communities adopt. Then in chapter 11, we look at what we call rational rereadings, because another way to organize and to answer the question why there are so many religions is simply to say religions are all reducible to something that's not religious, right? Psychological need, or biology, or illusion, or childhood experiences, or whatever, or society. You know, a man named Emil Durkheim famously defined religion as society worshiping itself. In other words, religion instills social values, essentially, and then claims that those come from on high, but actually it's just society tricking people into being good boys and girls. Those are what we call reductive readings of religion. They're a key component of the study of religion, and I'm calling them rational rereadings here. And finally, in chapter 12, I show them that it's not necessarily true that you have to choose between faithful rereadings and rational rereadings. In other words, there's a way to do both, and I call these reflexive rereadings. So here I show them that a lot of people have in fact concluded that all religious experiences can in fact be traced back to the human being, but to a human nature that's no longer simply material or biological, that there's something inherently spiritual or inherently transcendent about the human being. So you can be very suspicious of religious languages as about gods up in the sky. You can trace it back to the human being, but if you look at religious experience long enough and hard enough, it's very hard, I think, to walk away with just a purely materialist or sort of flatland view of human nature. And that's kind of where I leave them. And again, your grade for the course isn't based on which one of those you pick. But you give them these options at the end. And it turns out that young people are generally thrilled with this model. Again, not because they've got the answers now, but because they can talk about this stuff now in a way that makes so much sense. And in a way that can honor other people and other people's religious beliefs, and they can take their own religious beliefs seriously. But it gives them a language to be religious in a different kind of way, I would say. It's not a question of whether they're religious or not, it's how they're religious. And I think that's really what they're looking for. It's not an up or down vote. It's a how question. So just final few words, and then I'm done. We can have a conversation and bring out the pizza. No pizza, John?
No pizza.
We don't have a lot of majors, but our most popular, probably our most common, I'm trying to think of the right word here. The most common portfolio of a Raleigh major at Rice is a pre-med student. A pre-med. And the reason is, if you think about it, it's very obvious. A typical doctor or nurse or any kind of health professional in a modern day hospital is going to wander through a couple dozen worldviews in a single day. And if they do not have the cognitive skills to negotiate what they're encountering and to talk about what their patients are asking or feeling or fearing, they're severely handicapped, I think, in a modern hospital. The same is true for journalists, who are always trying to cover stories that involve beliefs or values or custom. The same is true for lawyers. The same is true, of course, for educators, high school teachers, elementary school teachers. So really, I mean, this is the thesis of the talk tonight. Really, to do almost anything in the modern world well, I think you have to be trained to think comparatively and to be able to balance sameness and difference. And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I have heard that emotional, intellectual, and spiritual maturity has been being able to hold the paradox. And I think your statement about the both and of sameness and difference is part of that. And the sad thing is how few people can hold that paradox or that ambiguity, can hold the both and. It seems to create an enormous anxiety in us. It's as if we must know the right answer. We must have the truth with a capital T. And yet, I want to just say, you say this is for young people at Rice. I wish all of the adults of the rest, it's something we ought to be doing about every 10 or 20 years and rethink what you're talking here. So I hope this textbook becomes usable out here for the rest of us too. Yeah, I've said more than I need to say.
Yeah, there's no reason it couldn't be used in any context, adult education, anywhere. I mean, it's kind of a how-to manual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff, I love your approach. I think it's great, and I just see threads in there, faith and reason, and the things that you've come through yourself.
Yeah.
You ask your students the question, what is your religious worldview?
Right.
Is that a fair question for us to ask you?
Yeah. No, it really is. And you know, the kids ask that. I shouldn't call them kids. The older I get, the more kid-like they become. You know, I grew up Catholic, as you probably know. I studied Hinduism for a number of years. I studied alternative religions for a number of years. I would describe myself as a dissenting Catholic in some sense. I'm deeply troubled by a lot of the positions of my own tradition. I would also describe myself as a mystical humanist. I really do think religion is all about the human being, but that the human being is really, really profound and probably ultimately transcendent. And I'm most drawn to the mystical traditions that are always taking apart their own dogmas and but they're always also affirming them at the same time. And so I guess I see my role, I mean, I've thought a lot about this. A lot of the questions I get along those lines it basically boiled down to, well, what would work in our world? How could we have stronger churches or stronger communities? And honestly, I don't see that as an intellectual's role. I see my role as more of a kind of questioning figure within the tradition or the culture. I think all healthy cultures throw up intellectuals and mystics and trickster-like characters to loosen things up and to keep the ball rolling. And that's sort of how I see myself. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
Starting to get pretty close to home. That sounds like to me in a way.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the closer we get to the mystics, the more inclusive we become. In a sense, it's as if we're all on the spokes of a wheel going to the same center.
Yeah.
And I always look at it as if I don't mean to make it sound like I'm preaching here, I wanted to get your opinion on this, but the brain can only absorb a certain small percentage of all the external consciousness that comes in.
Yeah.
And so we build a faith to fill in the gaps.
Right.
And it's just that I have different consciousness, and so I fill in the gaps differently than somebody in India or whatever.
That's right.
But only in the mystical tradition do you come to the same place.
Yeah, and that position's been critiqued extensively in the academy, but I still think it's basically true. I think whatever consciousness is, it's shared across the species, and that it's infinitely malleable, and so it's culture and language that shape it, but there's always these possibilities of something else, something greater coming in, and that's essentially my worldview. We call that the filter thesis. That the brain doesn't produce consciousness; it actually reduces it and filters it into culture and language and ego. And by the way, religious identity is simply an ego in my mind. It's part of the ego. Consciousness is not religious identity. We are not just fill in the blank, Catholic, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. That's what our culture has shaped us into, but that is not who we ultimately are.
We are not our thoughts.
Right. Nor are we our beliefs.
Ridiculous.
That's a tough one for people, actually.
Yeah.
That's you ask me what I think, that's what I think. And you know, when people ask me what I believe, I say I don't believe in beliefs. And I don't mean to be silly and I mean I really believe that, which doesn't make sense, but it's in other words, I think the way we put our worlds together is a cognitive function that our brains do and our cultures do. But again, it should not limit us. It doesn't exhaust who we are. Yeah.
Just building on your point about the pre-meds, there's a pretty senior physician who's in his 60s, who was a Rice graduate, and in a conversation one evening, I asked him what he valued most about his education. He said, majoring in English enabled me to be a better physician.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not in the medical world, but I don't want a doctor who's just studied cell biology. I'm not a cell. So I just think that's so obvious. And so this whole push for the medical humanities, I just think that's so healthy and so right. Yeah, Ken.
Thank you for this. I have lots of questions, but one I'm wondering when I encounter when I teach psychology of religion is I have a lot of students come to class who never stepped foot outside their own religious world. They've never been to a different religious institution.
Yeah.
And so what I do, I try to get them actually experientially to visit a few different places, to bring in different people, and to talk with each other. Do you do much of that with this in your teaching, or is it more, do you have enough diversity at Rice to be able to use the class too?
So I taught for 9 years at a Presbyterian liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, and a typical class had 20 to 25 kids in it, all of whom looked like me. Well, younger and better looking, but more or less, same gene pool. And there were lots of mosques and Hindu temples and things around in the area. And we did that. We did exactly that. We went on field trips to them because it was possible with 20 to 25 students. It's not possible with 200 or 250. And the student body at Rice is so dramatically diverse compared to the Western Pennsylvania scene. It's simply not as necessary, I think. I think it would be great if they would do that, but it's just a different demographic, and it's just practically impossible. But I think that's right. But I think also in a class like this, just reading about these traditions in a kind of balanced way, the message they keep getting is how sophisticated these other cultures are, and so it starts to wear down the stereotypes that they've been, perhaps some of them have been raised with those. Some of them haven't. And then of course there's some of the students have no religious background. And so they're asking a different set of questions. They often have religious questions but no religious background to draw from or to be limited by.
This is such a compelling description of your book. What did you use before this?
So, I used to use, this was at Western Pennsylvania. I have only taught this at Rice for 2 years. A colleague named Bill Parsons taught it before me. And they didn't use textbooks. The traditional way of teaching this course is through what we call the world religions model, where you have a textbook and the first chapter is usually on indigenous religions, and then it's Hinduism, and then it's Buddhism, and then it's Taoism, and then you go through all the religions. And there's a lot of fine textbooks like that. I've used them. The problem I have with that approach is it leaves the students thinking that they're a block, that there really is something called Buddhism, and all Buddhists think alike, and there's something called Christianity, and there's something called Islam and Hinduism, and it avoids all of the tough questions. I call it cultural cheerleading. You just get to say rah-rah for every religion you go through, and the questions they're asking is, well, what about this, and what about that? And they're already comparing, and that approach doesn't allow you to make that explicit. What this approach does is makes their questions explicit.
I really like it.
Yeah. We'll see if it works. I'll be interested to see if it works. I mean, I know it works in my classrooms. I don't know how broadly it'll work, but we'll see. Wiley Blackwell's doing it. It'll come out in fall of 13. Yeah.
I do some ethnographic work around healthcare, and been working with a bioethicist, and when I kind of telling what I was studying and stuff, he said, oh my goodness, that'd be cultural relativism. It was like, this was the most horrible thing. And, I tried to give an answer, but I don't think I've ever really been able to give a successful answer back to him that there's nothing really wrong with studying other cultures, that's the understanding. But I think maybe your comparativist idea, do you have any other thoughts on how you pose an argument back to a philosopher person who is very squeamish about cultural relativism?
Well, essentially that's the question of comparison, right? Because one of the reasonable answers to religious and cultural pluralism is that it is relative, that we're just all making this up. And there are no objective answers out there. There are only subjective positions that we're creating through culture and language and ritual and myth. So my first response to someone like that would be, maybe it's true. Maybe cultural relativism is in fact true. And it's certainly partially true, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all go to Chinese restaurants and Mexican restaurants and Japanese restaurants. Does anybody say, what's the true food? No. We have somehow accepted cuisine pluralism, but we haven't got to religious pluralism, because we still think religion is somehow like a photographic snapshot of some objective thing out there, when it's not. It's more like cuisine or language or art. So I mean, I would just hit that observation and sort of push the point further.
Yeah, just get it off of values and into some other things.
But I addressed.
Values is part of it.
Yeah, I actually addressed that issue in the textbook, because one of the dangers of this cultural cheerleading is that it does lead to moral relativism. And it is simply true that cultures do some really awful things to people that are simply indefensible from our own modern moral values, right? Like
genital mutilation.
Well, genital mutilation is usually the one. Shame murders. Stoning for homosexuals. So there's all kinds of deep moral questions there that need to be asked and addressed. Without the professor or the textbook always taking a clear position, But I actually do take a clear position on most of those because that's the perspective of the study of religion. It is coming from a set of essentially Western moral values and questions. And of course, Western culture is filled with problematic, murderous practices as well that we have to acknowledge and struggle with. Nobody gets off the hook here. I think Western science has killed more people in the 20th century than anything, right? Put the wars together, and the guns and bombs, and I mean, it's pretty clear what's destroyed the most life. So, yeah.
Nature of consciousness, you talk about soul. Historically, consciousness and conscience were kind of dealt with in the same words in the Greek and all that. But I didn't hear you mention anything about conscience. I always, when you look up those words, conscience is looking at the internal guide and consciousness, the external. Can you address that a little bit more openly?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do treat moral values and law. Law is another big one here, because law, a lot of legal codes come from religions. They don't come from secular systems. And so any religion that wants to survive over a long period of time has to create law, has to create all kinds of codes around the proper behavior. And that then leads into moral values and what you're calling conscience. I address that. I do not think consciousness is necessarily connected to conscience, to moral values. I think people have profound transcendent experiences of mind or consciousness in entirely immoral or amoral contexts. A car accident, for example, is not a process I would want to repeat multiple times. But people have profound religious experiences in physical trauma. Okay, does that mean we should be, imposing physical trauma? No, it doesn't mean that at all. So I think religion is really, it's a very complicated answer to your question, is that a lot of religious experiences erupt in contexts that are extremely problematic, morally or socially. And I just think we have to acknowledge both. In terms of actual value systems or morals, I think those are largely produced by, I'm more of a flatland thinker there, right? I don't derive my model of morals from a transcendent source. I think morals are created by cultures through human interaction, trying to get along, and that we're essentially programmed to get along for a lot of adaptive reasons, and that it's probably a mistake to see moral systems as somehow absolute or coming from above. But that's just my own position. I don't address that in the textbook. Claire.
I'm just curious how widespread, this sort of pedagogical take on a course as an initiatory process is. I mean, have you gotten feedback from other people or pushback?
No. I'm sure some people will like it a lot and some people will hate it in terms of our peers. Well, one of the funny things that happened, which is potentially not a good thing, but we'll deal with it, is Atta Anzali is one of my co-writers. He's one of my former graduate students teaching now. And Atta wrote me a couple of months ago and said, hey, I just found this textbook by this guy named Gary Kessler, and he sets it up exactly like an initiation ritual too. And I'm like, oh shit. So I ordered the textbook, and sure enough, doggone it, he does it. So I wrote my editor and said, hey, guess what? And her response was, look, nobody copyrights initiation rituals. Nobody owns Van Gennep or Victor Turner. It's okay. Just acknowledge that there's this other one out there that does similar things. But he actually does entirely different things. He just, the structure is the same, but he ends up taking it in a very different direction. So I don't know. As you know, as Claire would know, but the rest of the folks in in the room would not know is that the world religions model is extremely controversial and problematic now in our field. Because the belief is, or one of the strong feelings about it is that it's part of the problem. That it was in the 50s or 60s when it was developed, it was a progressive, sort of liberalizing, ecumenical way to do things, and it was very positive. But now it tends to cement people's religious identities, and we don't want to do that. We want people to be questioning those identities, not cementing them.
That's a novel idea.
What's that?
That's a novel idea, to be questioning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I love this class. Is this one of the generalized courses that most freshmen take? Or
This, I
is it
think,
to be in that school?
this is probably the most popular class among the undergraduates in the humanities. My estimate is 1 out of every 8 Rice students take this
I
class.
mean, it sounds like to me that as a mother of many people who've gone to college and many more that are still going, what a wonderful opportunity for all kids. You say that college is the initiation thing we have in our culture right now. Well, I think half the time you don't realize that's what's going on. You know?
No.
How nice to just say, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
I wish somebody told me that. Okay, this is where you are, and this is what's going to happen to you. It's just going to all blow apart any day now. But what a great introduction to a college career. I just think it would set you up on such a good
There's a safety or comfort level in that too for them, because you don't just say, okay, it's all going to blow apart now. Because it's already blowing apart for them, whether you say that or not. Okay? You say, okay, I'm going to help you blow it apart more, but we're going to help you put it back together. We're not going to leave you in pieces. And as long as you tell them that, they're like really fine, actually, with it. For the most part. The other thing you have to remember about any college course, or really any course, is that those people chose to be there. So the people you probably should really be reaching are not there. Right? But they then go into the dorms and the colleges and talk, and it generates, it has a kind of catalytic effect in the community for sure.
There's an interesting convergence with some of the psycho-religious stuff that we see in college, which is the measurement in terms of a lot of the kids do show pretty significant religious struggles, serious questions, doubts, conflicts that they're not just intellectual, they're quite emotional, troubling, they're tied to markers of real distress in the students. So I think your class would be a wonderful intervention, I think, but in that sense I'd really be interested in seeing how it impacts the students on just the kinds of dimensions you were talking about. Does it in fact, through measurement, lead to openness? Does it reduce the painfulness of their struggles? So you want them to continue to grapple with questions, but does it somehow provide them with more of an emotional secure base for grappling with those struggles? Does it lead to those changes? Can you measure it? Can you demonstrate it?
So my anecdotal experience says yes to all of those. But I think you should study it.
No, I think
you can run the study. There's 200 kids every fall.
I was thinking about it right now. I'll talk to you about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. I totally believe in this approach. I really think the comparative study of religion could do so many great positive things in the culture. But it's at this point, it's really restricted to higher education and lots of people, but it's still restricted. It hasn't really seeped further in. Just think about how religion is talked about on the media. Just think about, not to depress this all, but think about Fox News, or even the main channels, or even the really sort of middle ones, NPR. No, when religion is talked about, it's always talked about as a sociologist would talk about it. It's always how many people are in those pews, who's going to vote for whom, nobody gets up there and says, well, gosh, is any of this true? You know? I mean, how do we talk about, are we reincarnated, or do we live once and then die? I mean, how do we even address? Those are never addressed in the
You would
meeting.
never win an election.
No, it would not. And so, you know, the way I frame that is, we call that functionalism in the field. That you study something by looking at what it does, what function it serves. And religion obviously serves lots of really important functions. But that's only one question. The other question is, but is it true? And if it is true, what parts of it are true, and why are there so many answers to whether it's true? These are philosophical questions, essentially. So this has always been my debate with my mother, whom I love. But her religion for her is simply what you do every Sunday in this little German farming community, and how great it is that we all come together, and when somebody dies or suffers, or we all have this community, and isn't that just great? And I'm like, I know it does all that, but these are, you know, these other questions just not there, just doesn't process. And I think she represents probably the norm, probably the base position on these things.
Well, I think it's a real changing thing. When John said earlier about, you know, the holding the other ones, holding tensions and that sort of thing, none of us were, as I ever recall, were ever trained to do that. It was never a thought that, I mean, that wasn't the goal. You didn't, I mean, that was what you didn't want. But I think now, I think culture generally, just kids generally, people generally, are becoming different. And so, to me, this teaching is building up to where we're becoming.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have children, and I work with youth for a living, and the kinds of things that are debated in the political arena are just no longer issues among that. I mean, it's a joke.
I know.
It's a complete joke.
They don't think that way.
No, they're just in they're in another place. And not that they've thought through everything and can articulate it, but the kinds of things that are so politically divisive have been resolved, you know, for the most part, among a certain.
A lot of that is, I think, being in Houston, we experience it as being in Houston with the multiculturalism.
Yeah.
That isn't present in many places.
The way I put it in the textbook, and this is really dramatic to me, is if you looked at the policies of Rice University on discriminating on the basis of gender, religion, race, or sexual orientation, okay? They're all very serious policies. You absolutely cannot do that. All major religions discriminate on virtually all of those points. So a modern secular university is morally superior on these measures than all the world religions. What does that mean? You know, where are we? You know, I think that's a real serious problem, and we tend to just kind of gloss it over. But it's very apparent to me, because I know what the values of my university are, and they're the values of any good research university in the country. And then you just go to the local church or the mosque or the temple, and you'll hear the exact opposite. And then they'll break down our doors to send their kids to us. What's going on? So clearly there's not a conversation going on about that. Yeah.
But in a way, aren't you describing more of the fundamentalist nature of other religion as a fundamentalist wing, if you will, as opposed to, you know, the mainstream?
Yeah. I wish it were that simple. I don't think so, actually. I mean, I just think of my own family and my own hometown. They're just good old mainstream Catholics, you know. They're not radical. They're not fundamentalists by any stretch. But they constantly say things that make me realize that they've never had this. And it took me years to understand. Here's a personal story. You want a personal story? So my family's in this little town in Nebraska, and we go home all the time. So a couple times a year we go up there, and I feel a lot of love and a lot of sort of disjunction when I do that. And I kept asking myself, why is it that I have all these cousins who have gone to college, but nobody thinks like I do? Nobody's even interested in these questions. And then it hit me one day. I probably have hundreds of cousins, by the way. Not one of them majored in anything other than what? Business or pre-med or something like that. None of them studied the humanities. No one. And it made me realize that this is actually the issue. The issue isn't whether people get a good higher education. The issue is, are they studying the humanities or not? That's the issue. Because the humanities have been so devalued, have been so dismissed. We're painted as evil liberals, and as you fill in the blank. But these are precisely the ways you educate a populace to get along. This is how you train people to think. But if like we have kids come to us all the time saying, I want to major in religious studies, but my parents won't let me. And so our answer is, well, just double major. And so that's what they do. They go do their cell biology or whatever, but what they really like is philosophy or history or the study of religion or something. Because that's what turns them on. Because they're human beings, they're not cells again. Or they're cells, but they're more than cells.
So Jeff, I think it's wonderful that you're doing this teaching, and as a member of a Protestant congregation here in Houston of some size, it disturbs me that we can't somehow get more of this thinking into our congregations, if you will. And I see it as very necessary to get more of the both-and thinking in the people who are essentially movers and shakers in our culture.
Right.
And to me, that's a huge issue.
Yeah. There's no reason you couldn't do this, that the churches couldn't do this. I mean, some churches do this, by the way. I learned this. I first was turned on to the study of religion in a Catholic seminary, right? So the mainline churches do this, but again, it doesn't tend to translate into the churches and pews. And I think that's the problem you're getting at. And then a lot of the leaders don't have this kind of training, but some do. Some leaders do have this training. So I don't know. I mean, there are ways to do this. I mean, there's so much good literature on Christian theology and religious pluralism, and Christianity and the world religions. There's so many good speakers. There's so many people doing this. It'd just be a matter of your church inviting them. Mm-hmm. And I also teach in the continuing studies school at Rice, and this is what a lot of those classes are like. They're mostly professional adults in their second or even third career sometimes. And we say education's wasted on the young. There's a lot of truth to that. Because particularly when you're teaching about religion, 18-year-olds are driven really by mostly hormones. And that's great. Hormones are good things. But most of them haven't asked the tough questions. Because, it's not their fault, because they haven't had enough tragedy or suffering yet. But when you're teaching people in their 50s or 60s or in that range, wow, I mean, these are live questions, and the interactions are so much richer and so much deeper in so many ways. So, that goes on too. That goes on in the Houston community. That goes on in continuing studies. It goes on around the area. But again, remember, there's always that filter, right? People have to want to be ready for it and want to do it.
Sometimes the questions, I think, just have to come to you. You don't, they come, and once they come, you got them, and you can't get rid of them. I mean, there they are. But sometimes they come, and people, I'm not supposed to listen to that question, so I'm not going to listen, you know. I mean, interiorly.
Yeah.
Just, it's hard to go there.
But isn't there a fundamental difference in what people are seeking? Many people seek from their religion.
Yes.
And what people seek from a college course.
Right.
So, you know, you're talking about people who, in some ways, don't want to ask questions. They want to find answers, and they want to
They're suffering.
dive into them, and they want faith. And
Right.
it's not, and to take a step back and say, well, let's look at it from take a step back and let's look and let's compare and let's try to understand. It's there'd be real conflict, I think, with what many people are looking for from their religious life. Answers, not questions.
I couldn't agree more. That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And that's the functionalist dimension of religion, as opposed to the philosophical. You know, one of the things I do, Ken, too, with a lot of these classes, not so much this one, but other classes, is there's often a warning statement or a contractual agreement in the syllabus. And I basically warn them.
I do the same thing to my class.
And so it simply makes them be responsible for the decision to stay in there. And virtually no one leaves. You know, pretty much everybody comes back. But now when they come back, they have to make the decision to come back. They have to take responsibility for it. So,
Well, thank you.
thank you. Thanks for having me.